Welcome. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon and joining us for this webinar looking at the delivery of the Early Career Framework in small schools in rural and coastal communities. I am Leah Commissar, the Head of Impact at the National Institute of Teaching, and I'm going to be hosting this afternoon. But you will be hearing from colleagues involved in the delivery of ECF and also some of our researchers, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they speak. So in terms of a really brief introduction to the NIOT and why we're running these webinars, our vision is for a school system that nurtures teachers and leaders at all stages of their careers. And so it's really important to us to understand how best to support and improve the quality of teacher and leader development. And as a school-led organisation, it's critical for us to involve teachers, leaders, and those that support teachers in their training at all stages in our work and through our research. So I just want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to all those that have been involved in this work. So this afternoon, we will be looking at what the study that we did involved, what we've learnt, some examples in practice, some considerations for providers and trusts, and at the end there should be some time for some questions. In terms of questions, please feel free throughout the webinar this afternoon to ask any questions or share any reflections, and you can do that using the question and answer function that you should find at the top of your screens. We are doing these webinars now because we want to share what we've found as quickly as possible, but we have literally just finished doing this research and won't be at the stage of being able to publish all the findings until September. So we're really, really keen to hear your reflections on what we're sharing. If you've had similar experiences, different experiences, please do share with us, because we really want this to be kind of an ongoing conversation that can feed into this work. But it is hot off the press. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to Ellen, who will get us going this afternoon.
Thank you, Leah, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Turner, and I'm the Head of Evaluation and Observational Research at the National Institute of Teaching. So what did this study involve? This project was a mixed method study to understand how the ECF, the Early Career Framework, is being delivered in schools in rural and coastal communities, with a particular focus on small schools. And we're really seeking to understand how the ECF is being delivered and how it could better suit the needs of these schools. And this is a collaboration between the National Institute of Teaching, South West Institute for Teaching in Devon, and the David Ross Education Trust in North and North East Lincolnshire. And Jet aren't able to be here today, but are very much part of this study, and you'll be hearing from my colleague Jen Knowles at Swift later on in the presentation. And the aim of this project is really to generate formal evidence to learn from and share strategies that schools are using to manage the ECF and to influence the sector and providers and policy. And as you can see here, we're supported by a research advisory group, which you can see the stars in blue, across a range of organisations who are guiding us and sort of really ensuring that the way we interpret the findings, the way we share findings, are as useful as possible for the sector. And the orange stars show the areas where we did the qualitative research for this project. And really the background for this project comes partly following on from the national evaluations of the ECF, which found that it was obviously really valued, that particularly ECTs and mentors really valued their time together. But as we know, the issues with time and capacity, particularly for mentors and workload, and then these questions around contextualisation of the ECF for particular school contexts. But more specifically, the impetus from this project came out through conversations with our colleagues at Swift, who are really wanting to understand more about how the early career framework is suited to small schools, particularly in rural and coastal areas. And Jen will say a bit more about that in a moment. And as we work on this study, we're also aware of the components of educational isolation, and we're sort of influenced by this thinking because we're aware that some of the schools that we're engaging with may be experiencing some of this. And for this study, we've drawn on very broad definitions of small, rural and coastal, and I can say a bit more about that in a moment, because we're really interested to understand the experiences of schools across a range of contexts. So for the project, we did a quantitative survey across all the schools that we work with in the National Institute that are rural, and then a matched urban sample. And that was across the schools that are undergoing or taking part in the National Institute provision, either with ourselves or associate colleges. And this was sent to 210 schools. We had 132 responses. And for the qualitative research, we spoke to colleagues across schools that are working with a range of providers, because we're really focusing on the ECF itself, not on a particular mode of delivery or a particular programme. And we spoke to colleagues in schools in South West, North East, and a couple of colleagues in the Midlands as well. And we spoke to colleagues in 9 schools across 6 multi-academy trusts. And I'm going to hand over to Jen to talk through a little bit about the rationale for this study.
Super, thank you. So my name is Jen Knowles. As Ellen said, I'm the Director of Teaching School Hubs for Swift, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about why we're getting involved in the research and why it's important for us. So we're aware from all the educational literature that educational isolation brings about a range of different complex factors on schools in both rural and coastal areas, such as Devon. And these factors affect access to these national programmes, such as the ECF, including that kind of geographical remoteness from other schools, things like training venues, partners and networks. Now, in terms of our context, many areas of Devon are characterised by small schools. So if I just look at one of our teaching school hubs, so I work across 2 teaching school hubs, Colleton and Kingsbridge, and just looking at the Colleton teaching school hub area, which is SW4, 58 out of the 166 primaries have got less than 100 pupils on roll. So therefore, we've got a limited capacity straight away for those national programmes. We know that all that initial research shows that ECF mentors face challenges in kind of balancing and managing their mentoring responsibilities alongside their existing workload. We also know that kind of looking at the current requirements for ECF delivery, looking at kind of modes of delivery could be challenging, particularly with those schools where there's a really low geographical density of participants, potentially a poor travel infrastructure there as well, which are real barriers for in-person training for us. So we're really keen to look into this in much more detail. There was a number of other further challenges that were identified. So appropriate mentors, particularly subject and phase specific, particularly in our small schools, challenges with workload, and also schools' capacity to facilitate time off timetable for both training and mentoring. So for us, this was hugely important to get involved, because we want to understand the challenges that our schools are facing in delivering the ECF, both in rural and coastal communities. We want to really look into approaches that are currently being used and kind of best practice to try and mitigate these, and look at what models of support we might be able to use to try and kind of address some of these challenges. Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks, Jen. Great. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes now about what we're learning from the study. And as Leah mentioned, this is really hot off the press. We're just finalising our analysis at the moment. So we're really curious to hear your thoughts. And please do use the question and answer function as we're going through, if you'd like to. So the first thing that we've found through talking to a range of participants in schools, so school leaders, induction tutors, mentors and ECTs and ECF trust leads as well, is that the early career framework was really valued by the participants that we spoke to. And it was valued by schools of different types, and the colleagues in schools that we spoke to generally had very positive experience with providers as well. And this was borne out in the quantitative data, so 80% of all the ECTs that took part in the survey were very or somewhat satisfied with the induction offer across schools. And what I would say about the quantitative survey is we're seeing these results as really indicative rather than definitive, because we did have quite a small sample size for this, but we feel that that's still a good indication that the ECF is valued in schools, as we know from the national evaluation as well. That came across in our work too. And this quote here from this induction tutor and school leader in North East Lincolnshire really shows the value that this school leader felt is in the ECF, drawing on here, talking about ECTs being some of the best teachers in our school, really appreciating the structure of it and the evidence-based aspect of the ECF. And it struck us that despite the fact that the participants we spoke to in schools did talk obviously about how that it is time consuming, that it's a lengthy process, and there are obviously these questions around time and capacity, but none of the colleagues that we spoke to sort of talked about the need to reduce or cut the ECF or aspects of it. And as you can see here, this mentor saying, I totally agree with the amount of time it takes. And this ECT from a school in Devon was talking about the fact that it definitely does work, but also obviously referencing the fact that it can be challenging if you're not getting the right support. So this sort of really reiterates the feeling of the ECF being valued, but it is time consuming to deliver. And I think another caveat that's important to say about the qualitative research is that we're sort of very well aware that the colleagues that spoke to us for the qualitative research were those that have the time to talk to us, and that we were unlikely to be speaking to colleagues in schools that are having the hardest time with the ECF. So we're sort of keen to look at this as indicators of how other schools might be finding it if they wouldn't have had the time to engage with us. But we do feel that there is this general sense that it's being really highly valued. But there were really specific areas where colleagues talked about that the ECF could be made more manageable and ways that its potential could be expanded. So as this trust leader is mentioning here in Devon, many colleagues we spoke to talked about issues with registration, for example, on the DfE portal, talking about making systems and platforms easier to access, and particularly that initial phase of registering ECTs. And then, as this school leader sort of shows here in a small primary school in Cornwall, some of the colleagues that we spoke to talked about seeing ways to really expand the potential of the ECF and essentially make more of it. And this school leader here and a number of others that we spoke to were using the ECF as a professional development tool for other staff in the school, seeing that it was really useful and that they were both using it to sort of save time by doing one professional development model for the school at one time, or sort of saving time in that way, but also using it as a sort of extending the reach of the ECF. Another finding that really came out very strongly was the need for external support. And this was particularly true of the small schools that we spoke to in the qualitative research. And this, when we say external support here, we mean external supports. And the main area where this was, we saw this in our in the qualitative research, was with the trust, ECF trust lead, or the trust in general. And most of the schools that we spoke to were in trusts. And this was around external support. So, for example, from an ECF trust lead actually supporting mentors and ECTs and induction tutors at delivering particular aspects of the ECF. So this could include literally covering time on timetable for the ECT and mentor to meet, so covering classes, or organising liaising between different schools, enabling ECTs in small schools to see the expertise they need in another school, for example, if that's not available in the school they're placed in, they're working in, and really playing that key liaising role. And as this mentor here is sort of listing the range of ways in which the ECF trust lead was supporting them in this small primary school in Devon. And this ECT in North Yorkshire in a small primary school didn't talk about having such close support from the ECF trust lead, but did talk about the support offered by the trust was really essential to their workload, and the fact that they could access this wealth of resources, co-planning and things like that across the trust, and that made a big difference to their experience. And another way in which external support came out as really important was around expanding networks for extending professional learning and support beyond the school itself. And this particularly came up for ECTs, and this could be sort of informal, as this quote here shows, this ECT in a small primary school in Devon, really around having that informal support for the ECTs going through the same thing. But mentors also talked about this, and that mentors in particular, but both ECTs and mentors, really emphasise the need for it to be useful, and that not sort of networks for network's sake, but for example, mentors, a number of mentors we spoke to said, is literally just a WhatsApp group, just to know that there are mentors in other schools I can ping to ask particular things, but ECTs focus more on this sort of emotional support. And in the quantitative survey, almost half of ECTs said they didn't have enough contact with ECTs in other schools, and a quarter of mentors in the small schools mentioned not receiving any external support at all. So we can sort of see that this is likely affecting smaller schools more. And one of the things that really came out, was the third finding really, was around seeing lots of different ways in which schools were making the ECF work, and it looking quite different in different schools. And this there were sort of key differences between small schools and rural schools and larger and more urban schools in the sample. So for example, ECTs in rural schools were less likely to have weekly mentor meetings, and ECTs in smaller schools were less likely to have regular allocated time for the ECF than larger schools. And mentors in primary schools talked about feeling less able to manage the workload than in secondary schools. So we can see there are some key differences. However, we found no difference in overall satisfaction for ECTs across different schools, and no difference in confidence levels for mentors in delivering on the mentoring requirements across schools. And so for us, this is really sort of raised the question or making us think about that although there are these different models for delivering the ECF, they may not necessarily be better or worse. And actually our data suggested that the participants we spoke to didn't find one better or worse than the other across those key characteristics. And that may be because, for example, in rural schools, there are other things that the ECTs may be receiving that's not necessarily a weekly mentor session, which I'll talk about now from the qualitative work. So in the qualitative work, we really saw, again, that this really was borne out as well. So the schools we spoke to having quite different models for how they were making the ECF work. And we've drawn out in purple here, so these are some case examples, and we've drawn out in purple the really key mechanism that seemed to emerge from that school as to how the ECF was being made to work. It wasn't the only one, obviously, but we've just sort of drawn out a couple of the really key ones. So this medium primary school here talked about had the ECT and the mentor seemed to have a really strong relationship. They both talked about that, and that was a really core way in which they were able to make the ECF work. And they also talked about using the ECF materials flexibly. And this came up, as we know, this is something that's important to people with the ECF, that it can be contextualized. And in this particular school, they talked about really valuing the overall structure and that all of the content was helpful, but they like to be able to draw on in the order that was useful to them and that felt like it suited their school. But they did talk about wanting specific modules for their school context. In this small rural primary school with particularly sort of low staff capacity, this school seemed to be making it work through a very strong school community, a culture of everybody pitching in, and a whole school approach to supporting the ECF, the ECT, as you can see here in this quote from the mentor. So really everyone supporting the ECT. And the other thing that seemed to be really helping in this school was the mentor and the ECT. They also had a very strong relationship. As we know, that's essential for really good mentoring. But they also talked about having a very flexible delivery approach that worked for them. So it wasn't possible for them to meet regularly every week and put those slots in the diaries, which kind of links to what we saw in the quantitative survey. But they talked about catching meetings really all throughout the day, little snippets here and there, and that worked for them. And in this very small primary school with around 40 pupils in rural and coastal part of Cornwall, this school leader was mentioning facing sort of real challenges around staff capacity and the fact that, as we know in small schools, staff wear a range of hats, they're often doing lots of roles at the same time. And for this school leader, it was really the key support from the trust, as you can see here, talking about the expertise of the ECF trust lead that was really enabling the ECF to be successful in that school. And also drawing on the ECF as a professional development tool for all staff. In this sort of large secondary school in the southwest, this was again around support from the trust, and particularly here the strength of the ECT. So this school was facing a lot of challenges with delivering the ECF, but the ECT themselves were sort of reaching out for support and was particularly strong, and wasn't talked about not needing that much support. So we just put that up here because we know that really strong individuals is one way in which the ECF is working in many schools. In this medium secondary in the northeast, the ECF was really being managed by one particular member of staff. So this, as you can see, the quote from the mentor and induction tutor here, talking about really being the advocate for the ECTs and being the person who made sure the ECF worked in the school. And that was a really essential mechanism there for how it was being successful, and also a really strong and positive school community. This leaves us with some questions, as we mentioned, around obviously knowing that we've spoken to schools that are sort of having success with the ECF and have the time to talk to us. So we're really sort of questioning around the schools that don't have those key mechanisms. If we know that there's no one type of school that is better, that the ECF is better suited to, but it's more around key mechanisms, our question then is what's happening for schools that don't have access to these key mechanisms. So we looked in our quantitative data to look at a couple of examples of schools that may be in these circumstances. So, for example, this school here talked about having it. This was a maintained school. It's a small primary in an urban area in the northwest. Talking about the ECTs, the mentors, and the induction tutor here all talked about lacking external support, and that was making it a real challenge to deliver, and that the ECTs were seen to need support in the school, but that the schoolie didn't feel able to provide them with the support they needed. And this school here was a medium secondary in a coastal town I should say rural town in the Midlands, and this school here really talked about having an unclear handover process and sort of lacking school support for the key member of staff who was making it work in this school. So that has sort of left us thinking about this question of key mechanisms, and how the question of sort of how are schools making it work, drawing attention to these key mechanisms, that really at the heart of everything that we've seen sits the individuals, and we spoke to ECTs, mentors, induction tutors, school leaders, and the ECF trust leads, and we really saw the central role of individuals that are going above and beyond in making the ECF work, and we know they're really the heart of the programme. And here we've put individuals that have the motivation, skills and support to be able to deliver the ECF, their role in the ECF. We also know that another really key mechanism are strong relationships between the ECT and the mentor, and that was really borne out with our qualitative data in particular. In terms of school culture and structure, which was something that came up across all the schools we spoke to, we saw that that having a school culture that really facilitates professional learning and support was really essential. And obviously we spoke to smaller schools and larger schools, and we were seeing that in the smaller schools, colleagues were talking more about this whole school approach to supporting the ECT, and that the whole school approach was really important part of the culture for making it work. And in larger schools, the colleagues talked more about having clear structures, roles and responsibilities, but that did run the risk of ECTs sort of falling through the gap if they weren't in place. And obviously there are things that small schools and larger schools where these learnings could be shared across. Another key mechanism, as we know, is really important to particularly ECTs and mentors, that the ECF feels contextualised, it's relevant to the school context and to the needs of the ECT, and this came across really clearly as a key mechanism as well. And sort of this really important point that came up, as we mentioned, in particular, the external support for in-school delivery, and particularly for small schools. We saw this across, this came out really, really strongly in the data. And we've added a ring here to sort of identify the trust as external to the school itself, although obviously very much internal to the way that the trust is working, but that was a really essential role for the small schools in trust that we spoke to. But obviously that leaves questions with schools that aren't supported by trust in that way, and we know there are obviously lots of different types of trusts as well, so need to sort of examine that further, and what other external sources of support there can be for schools. And then this point around extending the ECF to sort of extending links and networks to extend learning and support beyond the school for colleagues, particularly ECTs, but also other colleagues in the school involved in the ECF. And this was important to the colleagues we spoke to as well. And across all of this, it's worth coming back to, because it was so clear that even if schools didn't have these other mechanisms, or even if they did, really at the heart of it all was individuals that are just going above and beyond to make the ECF work. And we obviously all know that that's really how the programme is working. But so we wanted to flag that as something that came out really clearly, but also as something that there is a risk of relying too heavily on individuals that are going above and beyond, and that the need to make sure that individuals are supported in that as well. So I'm going to hand to my colleague Helen to talk through how this is working, looking at some examples in practice from One Cornwall. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Ellen. So some of you may well know me. My name is Helen Argle and I'm a teaching school hub lead for One Cornwall. And we are 2 hubs which work across Cornwall, and I'm responsible for the ECF. So we have a we're highly academised in Cornwall, one of the most highly academised areas. But also alongside that, we have a lot of small rural coastal schools with those same challenges that Jen was mentioning in Devon as well. So we have those geographical challenges which involve travel and the isolation of those schools. So what we have found is that within these MATs, many of them have developed over the years an ECF lead role. So we've been working, obviously, for the last 3 years, we've been working with a couple of providers, and those ECF lead roles have grown out of the role of facilitator. So as part of wanting to engage with MATs at the beginning, we wanted to get a facilitator from the MATs. They facilitated for us on the programs, and then out of that created this ECF role. As the facilitator learned the program, they learned what was needed for the ECTs, and they became incredibly familiar with what was going on. They were working really closely with us, and they were able to then enforce that and support and enforce when needed the program and the engagement within schools. And what it actually means specifically is that they can, first of all, they can help those really isolated schools to connect. So maybe they haven't got enough staff to do observations, to observe other colleagues when it comes to those are specifically in the year 2, or when they need to do those observations. So the ECF lead, the ECT lead within the MAT can organise that and set up observations in other schools. They have that overview. They're able to know the expertise of the staff within the multi-academy trust that others can't do that. The other time is that it may be that there aren't enough staff for mentors. We have a huge amount of small schools that don't have enough staff to be a mentor and an induction lead and have to double up in that role, which obviously is not ideal and it's challenging in itself. So the ECF lead can go in and support that induction lead in their induction lead role to release them at times to go and focus more on their mentoring. We also have found that when there are concerns about an ECT or a mentor not engaging, or just general concerns about them, we're able to communicate with the ECF lead and they're able to communicate with us. It sort of adds in that extra layer of communication. It means that maybe some of those small schools that might have got missed out, or ones that were struggling, we're alerted about them more easily. If ECTs and mentors are struggling to navigate the platforms, the ECF lead knows them and can support them in that. And then they can chase up schools that aren't completing, so the statutory side of things for the AB role, they can chase up those schools that aren't responding with their progress reviews and assessments, and we use that quite a lot. And then one of the things that Ellen mentioned, but is really an excellent part of all of this, and an added bonus that those of you involved will have come across, is the way that they can then take the ECF materials and adapt them for the wider school CPD, which then means that the practitioners who are a year ahead, who didn't experience the ECF, are able to also experience the wonderful research and training that the ECTs get. And it's just been a really good relationship, and we're developing. But as Ellen said, the gap is those small schools that aren't in one of our trusts.
Super. And then I'm just going to pick up on kind of similar threads to what Helen was talking about, but really discuss it in a Devon context. So we have a very similar model to Helen. Our teaching school hub is built upon partnerships. So again, our facilitators are often those ECF leads in school, and it's been such an important role. And we do have termly check-ins for those ECF leads so that everyone's got a really, really good grasp of exactly what's going on in those small schools. There's a couple of other things which I've just shared on screen as well, which are things that we have put in place as a teaching school hub. And really, when we're talking about those individuals that are going above and beyond, it's our duty of care to really safeguard their workload, because they are being pulled from so many different angles. So one thing that we do is we have an ECF newsletter that goes out every Friday. That's to try and minimize the emails that we're sending to schools. We say to schools, it's quite lengthy, use it as an index. You don't need to read the whole thing, but if you have any ECF questions, if you need links to catch-up recordings, all of it is found in that newsletter. And it's our way of minimizing their workload and the feedback feedback has been really positive about that. And it just means that all of our schools, the ECF leads, the mentors, the ECTs, they've all got access to exactly what is going on, and they're not constantly looking through email threads. Another thing that we do is we have a termly ECF lead briefing. So these are for ECF leads from across all of our schools, but also those trust leads as well, where we can disseminate all the important updates regarding ECF, but also appropriate body. It means we can look forward to any assessments that are coming up, and then also look at what the term ahead looks like. And again, we get kind of 300, 400 at each of those meetings. They're really, really highly attended and really, really valued. And one of the other things that we do, and it is something that my programme manager has put in place, is we have a delivery calendar for our schools, because we've increasingly found that our schools might have a few September year 1 ECTs, and then a January cohort starter, and then some year 2 ECTs, and then they've got all these mentors to balance as well. And we think it's really important that that lead knows exactly what's going on in schools at all times, so they're able to have those informal conversations in the corridor and really just keep a close check-in. So you'll see our ECF leads with these pinned up on their notice boards behind their desks. We know they really value them because it shows exactly what's going on in the programme at each stage in the programme. And as you can see, that's just Spring 2 there. But again, everything for ECF leads, year 1, year 2, ECTs, mentors, and also our January starters. So a selection there of a couple of the things that we've tried to do to kind of minimise workload, because these people that are these induction tutors, these ECF leads, they do such an amazing job. We need to try and keep them in them. We have obviously got those kind of handover issues that Ellen talked about earlier, and I'll refer to again later, but we need to do everything we can to safeguard their workload whilst they are in role. Super, thanks, Ellen. In terms of looking then at considerations for providers and trusts going forwards, what we have done, we're really keen to know all of your views. It's really important that you let us know actually what you think are the most useful strategies going forwards. So as I talk through the next slide, if you were able to just take a kind of scan in the QR code, there's a very short feedback form there. Additionally, if you've got any questions that you want to ask, please do include them at the end of the form as well. Leah's kindly also going to put a link to that form in the chat. But we've got lots of strategies here for how we can support schools, but this is informed by the sample that we've looked like and the conversations that Ellen and the team have had, and we're really keen to make sure that we've got as kind of wide a knowledge as possible. So I'll talk you through a couple of these now whilst you're filling in the form, and just kind of really unpick a couple of them. So earlier I referenced that handover, so identifying clear mechanisms for handover and communication for key ECF staff in schools. I think we'd all agree that actually there are so many changes that have come in since September 2021, and our induction needs and our ECF staff have really grown with that. But if we do then get another member of staff in school that potentially has never dealt with an ECT in the past, there's a huge void of knowledge there. And we have got to really consider that handover process to make sure that they're not starting from scratch. And that's certainly something we've found with schools coming on board this year who've not been with us for the kind of years previous. I think we all assume that actually that knowledge is out there in the sector, but it's really not actually unless you've been working with ECTs. Looking at some of the other things, so facilitating strong links of mentors and ECTs in other schools, including informal ones that are useful. So lots of ECTs reference that actually they don't have those networks, and I think we need to try and put them in place wherever possible, particularly if they're a solo ECT in a school. I kind of reference the mechanisms and strategies to centralise workload, and really we're not just looking at the ECF leads that we talked about earlier, but also our ECTs and mentors. Resources and co-planning opportunities for all ECTs. Again, we might be talking about an ECT in a very small primary school that teaches several year groups, whereas we know in a larger urban school, we might have an ECT that's the 3 year 1 classes or 3 year 2 classes, and they have those co-planning opportunities. So really, it really enriches their experience and trying to put things in place to support them with that. Examining ways to provide all small schools with external support for in-school delivery. So we talked about the really important role as ECF leads that are kind of predominantly found in trust, but really making sure that all of these small schools have got access to this provision as well. A couple of the other things there to look at, guidance suited for different models of ECF delivery. And I think this is something that providers are really looking at, because the nature of our areas is so very different. So if I look at us in Devon compared to an area in London, our delivery model is going to be very different. We are going to have to deliver predominantly online because of the nature of our cohorts. We can't expect our staff to kind of travel kind of 1-2 hours to get to a session. But again, it's going to work very differently in different settings. ECT baseline assessments leading to a flexible and tailored approach. I know with all the kind of changes coming in 2025, there's a much larger emphasis on that, but I think it's really important that actually, in particular, their kind of self-study and that approach that their induction tutor uses is increasingly tailored to the ECT, particularly where ECTs have referenced some kind of crossover with ITT provision in the past. They're coming from a number of different providers. We've got many coming through the assessment only route who might have 6, 7, 8 years of experience behind them. And then that stage content for ECTs. So really front loading that practical guidance and emotional wellbeing that really needs to be the kind of full front of absolutely everything. So we've got a number of strategies there. We're really keen to find out which ones you think are most useful, if there's any additional strategies that you've identified, and also if you have any questions with regards to today, please do put them on the form as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. And yeah, really encourage you to access the QR code and the link in the link there if you can to look at the form. And if you don't have time to do it now, please do take the time if you'd like to, and a later point to share your thoughts with us. We're really keen to hear it. Leah, shall I hand over to you to talk about what's next?
Real, thanks. As I said, we are not going to be publishing this until next term. Still lots of data to be looking at, but we will be definitely sharing it really widely and continuing these conversations with trusts and providers and policymakers, and thinking about future research in the future. I don't know if you want to add anything on that point, Ellen?
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, just to say that because one of the things that came out of the research was really this, the importance of schools working together and how ECF trust leads is sort of supporting a range of different schools, and there's questions about how small schools that are not part of trusts can access that kind of support. And we know this is a big conversation in professional development broader in the sector. So we're really keen to explore future research, sort of starting in the autumn term, looking at models for professional development and communities of practice, and hopefully piloting different models suited for different school contexts. So that's one of the questions that we're taking away from this. But if you have other ideas for sort of really interesting or exciting research that you think we should do on the back of this, please do include them in the form if there are things that you think would be really important to look at next. We'd love to hear from you.
Brill, thank you. So we do have a little bit of time now for any questions or comments about anything that you have heard. I might come to, we've got a couple of questions. So one kind of around clarification that's come in, which is about definitions of rural and coastal. I'll come to you, Ellen, I think, with that one.
Thanks, Leah. And this is a really good question. We discussed a lot how to define rural and coastal in the study. So, you know, there's no sort of widely used sort of agreed upon definition for rural and coastal. For the quantitative research, we use the DEFRA definition around rurality for rural schools, looking at schools on 1 to 4 on that scale. And for coastal, we looked at schools that were in LAs with a coastline. And for the qualitative research, we took a very broad approach to this. So we were looking at, and for school size, I should say as well, for the quantitative survey, we were including schools that were in the 20th or percentile, in the bottom 20th percentile of school size. And for the qualitative research, we used quite a broad term for rural and coastal. So we said schools that are not in large urban areas, but other than that, we were keen to speak to schools. And we did, as you saw in the sample, we did include larger schools in the qualitative sample, just because we're really keen, because there is no clear definition. We're really keen to hear from a range of experiences, but particularly focusing on those schools that aren't in large urban centres with access to sort of the brilliant travel network and in close proximity to lots of other schools, as Jen sort of mentioned earlier as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question that we've got is around implications of this research maybe for other professional development, like maybe thinking about also initial teacher education. Jen, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I just think that with the kind of increase in mentoring for initial teacher training that's coming in September 2025, all of the findings from the sector on ECF are going to translate into that initial teacher training. These mentors that we have in school for ECF are often also the ITT mentors. So I think if we can think collaboratively across these programs, hopefully these findings can really feed into that as well.
Well, thank you. And we've got a question around deprivation across the schools. Did you look at the levels of deprivation in the different schools, and was it similar or was it very different depending on the school? Ellen.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, another really good question. And it was, so in the quantitative survey, we did look at deprivation, and we looked at schools that were above the national average for pupil premium in schools, preschool meals in schools. And in the qualitative survey, qualitative sample, this did come up. So, but as you can see in the way we looked at it with the sort of case examples, we took account of the school context overall. So that included number of pupils with free school meals in the school, along with lots of other kind of contextual areas that we looked at, and that really, but I think worth mentioning that along with sort of school size and rural, the characteristics that we talked about, ECTs and mentors not having a broadly different experience in either of those schools, we also found the same for level of deprivation. It wasn't a marker of like a real difference of experience in the sample, although I should say again that our survey response rate was low, so it's kind of indicative. So we know it is important. It came out in the qualitative research as well that every school is having a different experience. So it's very much part of how we've been looking at the findings, but I wouldn't say there's anything like overarching at this stage that we've pulled out that is really clear around level of deprivation in the school and experience of the ECF.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got an interesting question around, which maybe I might come to both of you for your thoughts on, around whether you've seen through the research or experience about the impact of having kind of mentors in different schools and whether that seems to have been useful, not useful. Should I come to you first, Jen?
Yeah, I personally think it's quite a challenge because I think that mentor is the person that's on the ground, they're supporting them on a day-to-day basis. So whilst they can engage in instructional coaching and they might be able to do some kind of drop-in lesson observations, they're not there the whole time kind of immersed with them. So I know schools and trusts that make it work, but I just kind of be conscious of the amount of time they're able to spend with that ECT. So I think you'd really have to kind of look at the context. But I think the ECTs report to us that their mentors are one of the biggest things that's helping them to kind of grow and thrive throughout the ECF. So having someone that actually, if they just had a really awful year 10 lesson, they can go and find their mentor and have a conversation with them, even if it's just 2 minutes to touch base and kind of recline the times themselves for their next kind of lesson ahead of a more formal conversation. I think it's really nice to have them based in the same school, but I know capacity can be an issue.
I might just chime in there and say I totally agree with you, Jen, in terms of what came out of the research, what came out in the research study. And we actually did put this to ECTs and mentors and induction tutors as well about whether or not that was the solution to some of the capacity challenges, about whether a mentor in a different school would support. But our findings just really reiterated what you've mentioned, Jen. And I think the point about the practical support and emotional well-being support for ECTs right at the beginning, that was so important to the ECTs we spoke to. And as you've mentioned, Jennifer, that they talked about that being really important to get from the school. Obviously, or they're part of the school community, and feeling like they have the mentor in the school was really important to the ECTs we spoke to. And I think the point around extending links to other schools in a way that's genuinely useful, that was kind of came out of discussions around as well about having mentors in different schools. And there was a little bit of ambivalence in some of the colleagues that we spoke to, saying potentially if it was really useful. So for example, around subject specialism, really specific needs around subject specialism, for example, in secondary schools. And I know there's work going on in this space around this question. And that was something that was given as an example of something that might be really useful for a very specific need, but that wouldn't replace the need for a mentor in school. That was certainly the view of the ECTs, and all of the colleagues that we spoke to actually talked about the importance of the mentor in school.
Well, thank you. So we've got a few other questions that I think will roll into kind of our thinking, and thank you for all your comments that have come through as well through the form. So I know that we'll be pouring through those and using them, and hopefully contacting some of you for kind of further conversations about this work, because it's really important and we want to make sure that we're hearing as many voices as possible. So that just leaves me to say a big thank you to all of our speakers today and everyone that's been involved in this work. If you would like to receive updates on other research that we're doing, there's a QR code there, or you can find it on our website. Or if you want to get in touch with us about this research or other pieces of research that we're doing, please feel free to email us. So thank you so much all for joining this afternoon. I hope you have a really nice rest of your day, and look forward to speaking to you or seeing you more in the future. Thanks very much.